gentlemen.
Can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. Sorry, I'm making that sound not because I'm Michael Barbaro, but because I recorded a couple minutes of this podcast and then realized that the microphone was not on and nothing was recording. So until aliens catch those sound waves and reconstruct them eons from now, all of that will be lost to history. And it's a tragedy. Actually, that's a good place to start. Aliens capturing sound waves or radio waves. If you ever seen the movie Contact with Jodie, what's her face, and Matthew McConaughey. Come on, why can't I even remember Jodie, what's her face's name? Foster. I'm sorry, it's that kind of morning. Actually, I should back up. I am in Springfield, Illinois. Not the birthplace. Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky, but the home of Abraham Lincoln. I came out here on Lincoln's birthday, which was last night, which was also Super Bowl Sunday. And I'm staying at the Abraham Lincoln Hotel. It's a hotel with a tradition of existence. And because of crazy scheduling things this week and next, I am sort of hard pressed to get all my stuff done the normal way. I am going on vacation next week with friends and don't know if I will be producing any content worthy of the entirely value neutral phrase content. But anyway, so I'm recording this as a solo. Maybe we'll record a normal conversational remnant on Friday so that you're not stuck with two solo remnants this week. Apparently Guy, my amanuensis or major domo at the American Enterprise Institute is, or as they say in History of the World Part 1, Piss Boy, hates the solo remnants, hates having anything to do with them. And when I told him there might be two this week, he said it filled him with terror. What to make of that, I don't know. Whether to care, I don't know. So where was I? Oh, right. Movie Contact. So Jodie Foster, Matthew McConaughey. It was an interesting movie at an interesting time, and it really does give you a sense of where things were in the late 90s. The movie was based on the book by Carl Sagan, and it was this really weird mix of science-philia and science-phobia. One of my favorite lines, and I remember I was kind of obsessed with liberal nostalgia in the late 90s, and there was all sorts of stuff in that movie that was very fear the future kind of stuff, which was weird because it was a Carl Sagan movie, which is all about how science is awesome. And maybe they just didn't realize that the Matthew McConaughey character was supposed to be more of a antagonist or something. I don't know. I never read the book. I was never a huge fan of Carl Sagan's. But anyway, Matthew McConaughey in one of the scenes, I think he's on Larry King show on CNN, and he says, something like, can you name one time in life where technology has made humans happier? Or something like that. I should have probably checked the quote before we started this, but I wasn't planning on talking about it. And it always stuck out at me because it's like, yeah, I can remember lots of times where technology has made people's lives better. I don't know, penicillin, the automobile, the need not to churn butter all day, the need for women not to sew for 18 hours a day. I mean, you can go through all sorts of things that have, what Francis Bacon called the relief of man's estate, which is what science and technology does. And I'm interested in this stuff a lot these days because of the AI stuff, and I'm working on this project, but we'll get to that. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. I don't know. I don't like working through ideas on the podcast in ways that I don't mind it in the G file. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a second. The movie Contact. The reason I've been thinking about the movie Contact is, so I did meet the press yesterday. I'm recording this on Monday, and which would make yesterday Sunday. Afterwards, Chuck Todd asked me to do the Chuck Toddcast. You get it? It's a podcast called Toddcast. And it was fine. It was fun to talk to him. Chuck and I are about the same age. He's obviously more liberal than I am, but we see things in a lot of the same ways. He's like the only guy I've run into in a while who basically agrees with me on all sorts of China stuff. Anyway, it's a good conversation. But one of the points I made on there in that conversation was how you can take so many of the clips from the nightly news, from cable news, even from White House statements, from John Kirby, the national security spokesperson, and you could put them into movies like the movie Contact, because that was one of Contact's. They weren't the first to do it, but they were close. This was a big controversy in the middle 90s about blurring the lines between news and Hollywood, and people went back and forth about what was appropriate and what wasn't appropriate. But Contact has all of these clips from, or at least this is my memory of it, from the news. And the one I always remembered was when there was a meteorite or something like that was found to maybe have had organic matter in it, which suggested that there might have been life on another planet. I think this was clawed back since then. Like maybe the microorganisms or the microfossils of microorganisms had snuck into the rock after it hit Earth. I don't remember. But anyway, Clinton gave a press conference about it. And the producers took that press conference and kind of cut it up in a way to make it seem as if the alien contact in Contact was what he was talking about. And you could take so many of the clips from the last week about shooting down these unidentified objects and put them into Independence Day kind of movies, Contact kind of movies, without any CGI, editing of their lips or their audio or whatever. Just the actual straight cuts sounds like the first 5 minutes of a War of the Worlds type movie. We shot down the fourth in 3 days of these unidentified flying objects, and the White House is being very quiet about what it means and what they are and where they came from. I mean, literally like word for word from Hollywood scripts kind of thing. And for all I know, there'll be like 10 more shoot downs in the next by the time you guys hear this. But anyway, that's what brought that to mind. I don't have much more to add on the balloon thing. Oh, I did one thing that I got some largely positive, but some negative feedback from. I've been making this point for a while now that we should stop getting hung up on the fact that the thing was a balloon. So it's a balloon, fine. It was a dirigible, right? Pod keeps calling them Zeppelins, which I don't think is right. But they are as drones. They're all drones, right? Whatever, any of these things that are being guided from a faraway place to spy on America are surveillance drones. And so we had been talking on Meet the Press about, how there was a lot of stuff on social media about how this is aliens and blah, 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 blah. In part because of the new information vacuum from the administration, people are filling in the blanks themselves. And I made this point about the drones, and then I just sort of said, I don't mean to rehash the alien thing, but to quote Yoda, or to paraphrase Yoda, the drone wars begun they have. And I did not do it in Yoda voice or anything like that. What would, I'm not a good impersonation guy, but the drone war, no, I'm not going to do it. Yeah, you thought I was going to do it. I can't do it. Maybe we'll put a version of me trying at the end of this thing. So, but the drone wars have begun, right? I mean, whether or not China is lying about shooting down unidentified flying objects over China, they're saying they are. And we're going to have a lot of, false flags is the wrong term, but we're going to have a lot of weird talk about how the skies are full of these things. Apparently I don't know if they're full of them, but the skies have a lot more stuff in them than we realized. And I really want to know what this cylindrical thing that we shot over Alaska or maybe Michigan, what its means of propulsion was. I heard someone on NPR say that it was only moving as fast as the wind, which would suggest it's some sort of glider kite kind of technology, but it's as big as a car. And, so what's it doing up there? I don't know. This does remind me, I remember in either late high school or early college, but we used to talk about it a lot when I was in college. It's a true story. You can Google around for it. There was a dude who tied a whole bunch of helium balloons to his lawn chair. I mean, like a bunch, like basically the movie Up, but with a lawn chair kind of thing. And then he untied it from the ground and went up really high. I can't remember. Maybe my memory says it was higher than it was, but I believe it was spotted by commercial passenger aircraft. And he had a BB gun with him that he would use to ping, to put out one balloon at a time to manage his descent or something like that. I wish I could remember how it ended. I'll find out the second I finish talking about this. But that has always, that is one of those things that comes up in my stress dreams from time to time, is the idea of being on some cheap old, nylon strip, sort of faded rainbow pool chair, and being like, holy crap, this is going much higher, much faster than I planned. And forget how cold you would be. Just like this is, I immediately regret my decision kind of flop, sweat, panic. And I'm not super terrified of heights. I am pretty terrified of falling. Anyway, all right. So enough with the silliness. You'll note how I don't complain how I feel so stupid doing these things from, every time I do them, but I still sometimes really feel stupid doing this. I'm sitting here looking over beautiful downtown Springfield, Illinois. Actually, right out my window is the Wyndham Hotel and the Starbucks. And that's about all I can see. So where to go? So I'm going to write my LA Times column today, which will be up at the Dispatch, later in the week. I think I'm going to do it. Well, I shouldn't say I think I'm going to do it. Like when I say I think I'm going to do the G file on something, I'm sincere about that because I don't know what I'm going to write the G file about when I'm recording these things. I know what I'm going to write the LA Times column about because I always have to talk to my editor the day before just to make sure they don't have somebody else doing it. So I'm going to do something on this Buy America stuff, which I think is kind of it's a depressing backslide for Republicans to be all in for this stuff. It's also a weird sort of, there's a lot of weird talk about how this is like a new position for Democrats when I was growing up, this was in the DNA of Democrats going way back. We called it protectionism back then because it is protectionism. The Buy America thing is protectionism. When I was a young policy gnome at AAI, we did my old boss, Ben Wattenberg, we organized, because I did a lot of the scut work, a debate between Phil Gramm and Dick Gephardt on protectionism. If memory serves, it was a bad debate altogether. Generally, it's really interesting. Politicians are bad debaters. American politicians. I suspect that British politicians are much better debaters because they all come, I shouldn't say all, but disproportionately come out of those, elite schools where they do the Oxford Union style debates. They come out of those elite high schools where they do that, where they take rhetoric more seriously. And because of things like prime minister's questions, the parliament takes their political system rewards rhetorical skill more than our system does. I only ever asked Charlie Cook about this, but I remember talking to Kevin Williamson about this. And he said he had talked to Charlie about it, because if you listen to Charlie, when he's on the editor's podcast or when he's on here, he has almost this sort of 19th century way, this weird cadence of asking a rhetorical question and then either implicitly or explicitly answering it. Of the good talkers I know, he is probably the best at the dramatic pause of anybody in this sort of podcast pundit space. And Kevin, Kevin's answer was that it was in part just because it was sort of in the water in school when he was growing up, is that there was a certain expectation that if you're sort of like being a good writer, you were also going to be a good talker like that. But anyway, politicians tend to be pretty bad debaters in my experience. I've debated a few. Anyway, the Gephardt Graham thing was bad. I'm getting distracted by this fascinating question about why American politicians tend to be bad at debate. But we can put a pin in that and come back to it another time. This Buy America stuff is such old hat. And I understand why it is popular. I understand why it sounds popular. I understand why it sounds good. Of course, we should, buy from our own and all that kind of thing. And I want to be clear, I am not as purist on this kind of thing as some people are. I am much more sympathetic to the idea of if you live in Springfield, Illinois, buying from your local community. I think that kind of stuff makes a lot of the emotional appeal there makes a lot more sense to me than sort of at the macroeconomic scale of Buy American in federal contracting and all this kind of stuff. I'm also partly for political realism's sake, but also partly for national security reasons. I'm open to and at the margins in favor of some of these things in things like defense contracting, even in agriculture. I'm here to speak to an agricultural group. At the margins, I'm okay with things that would maintain our capacity of self-sufficiency in the production of agriculture. But one way to think about it is we have a Buy America program when it comes to sugar in this country. And it's the Florida sugar subsidy, which Marco Rubio has fought for, which every Florida politician has fought for. And it's garbage, right? Growing sugar in Florida is more expensive than growing it in all sorts of other places. And we, not to get all Mansur Olson on everybody, but, he was the guy who coined the phrase or the concept of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. It costs everybody a little more money to buy Florida sugar, but it delivers massive profits to Florida sugar producers. At least that was the case. I don't think we've done anything about Florida sugar subsidies in the last few years since I looked at this. It would be sort of, and to have sugar subsidies in America is like having citrus fruit subsidies in Canada. There are probably a handful of places that can grow, lemons and oranges and all that kind of stuff. But is it really the highest, best use of Canadian tax dollars to be growing stuff in that climate? And, while the Florida climate is fine for sugar, there's just not enough room to grow the sugar to meet demand here. And it's basically, a law that says we're gonna charge everybody more to benefit a handful of people. That's how I view. But on the CHIP Act stuff about building a high end semiconductor plant in the United States, and why are they still semi? We've been building semiconductors for all my life. When can we get the full conductors? But we've learned with the supply chain stuff and with the China tensions that having all of our eggs on the island of Taiwan when it comes to the high-end stuff doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I have no problem with, at the margins, figuring out ways to give us some durability and self-sufficiency when it comes to critical national security type stuff. But I would err on drawing that line really narrowly. We should be able to build fighter jets in this country, or at least get fighter jets, the parts we need for fighter jets, from very friendly countries that we would have a hard time imagining going to war with, right? We want supply chains for the crucial national security stuff embedded with either on our own soil or among nearby allies. And I think when you look at how there are so many interesting new lessons or old lessons being relearned about logistics and supply lines, not just from the pandemic, but really from the war in Ukraine and the taking seriously the possibility of war in the Taiwan Straits, getting all that stuff together, even if there's an added economic cost to it, makes a lot of sense to me, or at least I am definitely open to the arguments. And you got to kind of look at it closely because that's part of the problem. Everybody ends up wanting to make some sort of national security argument for if the exception to free trade principles is going to be national security, then all of a sudden every single widget and doodad in this country is going to be claimed to be essential to national security. You know, there's this debate about whether or not Chinese and other countries can buy American farmland. And, I'm looking into some of this stuff because of the talks I got to give next day or two. And the thing is like, that doesn't bother me at all. First of all, from a trade perspective, if Chinese firms own American farmland and want to cultivate it as farmland and sell those products, that is probably going to be a pretty good bulwark against a trade war with China over agricultural goods, because it's going to be China's own firms going. I think a lot of that Belt and Road mercantilist stuff that China's been doing for the last 30 years doesn't make a lot of economic sense. But if they want to do it, and if that's a way to sort of hedge against trade barriers, then I think it's fine. But people who say we're going to lose the ability to control our land in a time of war or anything like that, I'm sorry. Like, if we go to war with China, I suspect that the Chinese held farmland in the United States will not be seized and exported to China anytime soon. And maybe after the war, there will be some court cases about, unlawful takings or repatriation funds or reimbursements or whatever. That's fine. But like, if that land is producing wheat during the World War III with China, that wheat ain't going to Beijing. So like, who cares if China owned it? Like, where do you draw the line? Dominic Pino, I got to go find it, did a great piece over at NR about all this, where all of the stuff that Biden is most into about Buy America is like American lumber, and American glass and American this and, American construction materials. Take American lumber. Well, okay, American lumber, I've got no problem with American lumber. I also, I kind of have a environmentalist, conservationist kind of point of view that if we can get lumber more cheaply from Canada, and that's where American lumber industry really has a problem, is they want to keep Canadian lumber out because Canada has a lot more trees and a lot more lumber on the market. If that means we have more old growth forests in America and fewer in Canada, I'm kind of a natural resources nationalist on this stuff. Like, let's have our forests be bigger and better and older and cut down more Canadian trees. But like, if you want to ask the question, why does it cost so much money to build a house? You're basically saying, you're telling a middle-class family in America, yeah, this house is going to cost you $10,000 more, or whatever the number is. It's just a hypothetical. So that people in America so that the American lumber industry can sell you more expensive wood than Canadian wood. And it doesn't matter how you sort of hide the ones and zeros and move the bump in the carpet around on this stuff. The simple fact is that we would be taxing Canadian lumber at a higher rate, be a sales tax or some sort of other import tax on cheaper, equally good materials. I just have no confidence that, there's a lot of poetry in that concept. There's a lot of like romantic, warm feelings about saving American lumberjacks or whatever. But why do we think the government has a better idea of how to set prices for those kinds of commodities? And what bothered me about that State of the Union address is Biden is saying how, I'm a capitalist, but capitalism without competition isn't capitalism. And what he's saying is he doesn't want American companies, American firms to face competition from foreign firms. And this, the invitation to cronyism and self-dealing and rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies, which we got a lot of in the Trump administration, and we got a lot of in the Obama administration, and it looks like we're going to get a lot of in the Biden administration. It's just such an unbelievable invitation to do that kind of thing when you create these amorphous standards about buying American, particularly in a global supply chain where you've got bits and pieces made all over the world. You then basically give bureaucrats the ability to set arbitrary numbers about where, is this engine block 50% American, 70% American, 30% American? And the idea that you can't trust businesses to make these decisions for what is best for their business so they can be competitive in world markets, I think it's nonsense. And it's so contradictory because Biden keeps talking about, and so do Republicans, talking about economic competition with these other countries. And they seem to think we'll be more competitive if we protect all of these firms from competition and protect consumers from lower costs. I'm not saying there aren't smarter and dumber ways of doing some of this stuff, but big picture, I just, barring the national security stuff, I don't buy that the Biden administration is going to have a steely-eyed, disciplined approach to this. And it's not going to be more about which lobbying firm got the right person on the phone to say, hey, look, we're more American than those guys. Let me give you an example from real life. And I got to be very careful because this is not a deeply reported, let the other side respond to the accusation kind of thing. But I know a conservative organization that got very Trumpy, fired a lot of non-Trumpy people. And the accusation was, which I've heard from more than one person, I feel comfortable describing it abstractly because I'm not naming any names. The accusation was that the new leadership came in and just got rid of competitive bidding for all sorts of contracts, rewarded friends, rewarded family, did all sorts of inside dealing, picking winners and losers, which ended up meaning that the donors' money was being spent inefficiently and profitably on friends of the people running the organization. And I remember at the time when this was all being described to me, thinking, what a great little example of sort of, Trumpy economics in miniature, where you basically just sort of think, my friends are my friends and therefore they deserve special consideration, and my enemies get nothing. And anybody who isn't my friend is presumptively my enemy. And since it's not really our money anyway, let's just all scratch each other's backs. And I think there's an enormous amount of that kind of thing in the nonprofit sector generally. And I definitely think that's the case on the left as well. I mean, it's admittedly an outlier, but you look at the corruption of things like the Black Lives Matter Foundation, buying mansions and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of that, but it's what was interesting to me about it was the sort of how the micro behavior track was consistent with the new way of thinking about how to do economics in America. And the second you start having this attitude of we are going to throw aside notions of competitive bidding, lowest price, all that kind of thing, efficiency, passing on savings to the taxpayer or the consumer, and instead the more poetry and the more gauzy romantic feeling you insert into the policy making process, the more you get a bunch of actors at the decision points in government basically saying, hey, look, I now have a lot more leeway to sort of say, you're one of the good guys, so I'll get you that contract, but you got to do something for me. And, I think that's my biggest problem with the Buy American stuff is it basically it's a backdoor way towards what Edmund Burke or John Locke would call, arbitrary power, the ability to make decisions based upon your gut without reference to clear, fair, neutral rules that are designed for the benefit of everybody. And then, I mean, there are obviously all sorts of other problems, which I guess I'll try to figure out or delineate when I write about this. But, it's like when you start doing Buy American, that encourages all of your trading partners to start doing Buy Canadian, Buy French, Buy German, and you're on your way to a trade war or whatever. It also just, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to think this through because I got to write about this. I think it also just reduces, it not only does it second guess the ability of business, of business people to figure out what's best for their firms, it also second guesses the ability of consumers to figure out what's best for them. I mean, let's say, I don't know, your kid has some disease and there's a medicine made in Germany and there's a medicine made in Ohio. And the medicine made in Germany is much better, much more efficacious than the one in Ohio, and it's cheaper. But there is a Buy American policy in pharmaceuticals. Should you really defer to the government for what is best for your kid and for your ability to afford taking care of your kid simply because of this concept of Buy American? Of course, that's a fiendishly clever example because it's not about national security, but it is about, the life of the loved one, which is also a sort of gauzy romantic, legitimately so, concept. But okay, so now let's say it's your family business, not family business. Let's say it's, you want to build your house and you cannot afford to do it unless you buy of equal quality Canadian lumber at Canadian lumber prices, and the government is saying no, you have to Buy American, and it's an extra $50,000 or whatever the number is. Why should you defer to the government for that decision? Why is your bottom line economic consideration illegitimate or inferior to what is good for the government? And this gets into things like, so there was this thing, now I forgot I was going to write about this and I didn't. I think it's too late now. But, Ezra Klein did this, and I wouldn't have taken it so seriously except some economist guys from the George Mason, Mercatus world, were tweeting about it. And I thought, okay, well, if they take it seriously, I should too. He had this long piece. It was interesting about how productivity in construction has crashed since, or I shouldn't say crashed, has stagnated since about 1970 in real terms, right? Investment hasn't gone down. Productivity has. Construction has literally gotten more expensive and more difficult, and I would argue at least aesthetically worse since the 70s. And we don't really get too deep in the weeds in it. The funny thing about Ezra Klein is I think he's a very smart guy, and I'm trying to let all sorts of past animosities get memory hold because I don't like to carry around, old stupid blog fights from 15 or 20 years ago. But the funny thing about reading Ezra is he's like a mom of a screwed up kid who will talk about all the reasons why his kid has had bad luck, except for the fact that he's a screw up. He will talk about all the very real problems we have in our society, but government can never be the problem. The government can never be the cause of it. And whenever government is the cause of it, it's sort of the wrong kind of government, or the small c conservatives in government who are to blame, and the right-minded liberals who believe the government is there to do all good things for people are never to blame. And if they could just be given the power to do the right things, everything will be fine. And so his explanations are all over the place about, there's sort of this implied thing about, sure, regulations might have had something to do with it. But anyway, I sent this piece off to a couple people I know in the construction business, very successful people in the construction business. And they're like, I think it's just all regulations is the problem. It's really difficult. And, and again, Dominic Pino, he does great stuff at NR. He ran through OSHA, founded in 1970, the Clean Air, the Environmental Protection Act, 1970, all of these things founded in or around 1970 that, the date that Ezra Klein, marks as the beginning of this problem, while basically at the same time excluding government from the problem. It kind of reminded me of George McGovern wrote this famous op-ed, I think in like 87 or 88 for the Wall Street Journal, where he was like, I spent most of my life in government. I was in the Senate. When I left the Senate, I gave some speeches. I saved up that money, and then I bought, I think it was the Stanford Inn in Connecticut, because he always wanted to be an innkeeper. And then he writes this op-ed for the Wall Street Journal about, man, I wish I knew about all of the regulations and red tape and litigious rules that we have suffocated American business with when I was in the Senate. And this is George McGovern, like the dashboard saint of American liberalism in the late 60s and early 70s. And he was like, man, we just screwed the private sector in this country with all of these pointless regulations that don't let business people make their own decisions. And anyway, I think that the construction stuff is, I'm really I was listening to this piece on NPR this morning about Berlin, and it made me think of all of this stuff. They're doing another election because somehow they really screwed up the election and have to do a do-over. But they're talking about on NPR about how this is sort of a symptom of a larger problem in Berlin, where every conceivable, quote unquote, stakeholder in society has to approve any decision. So nothing gets done. And they were like, to do the, what they call them, the zebra crosswalks, the black and white stripes for a crosswalk, like outside of City Hall, like I can't remember, I was getting coffee when I was listening to this, but it was something like 14 or 23 different groups have to sign off on it. And so nothing gets done. In Washington, my wife and I call it the coalition against everything. There are these groups who just simply hate commerce in my neighborhood. They hate change. They hate when there was growing up in New York, I would have called a bodega, even though it was run by a non-Hispanic person in my neighborhood when I was, when we first moved into the neighborhood. And he did this thing where he convinced the local community board, it's called the ANC or something like that, to back his petition for an expanded liquor license. Because he told them that he would go out of business otherwise. And it was only because this was one of these sort of part of the neighborhood, traditional kind of fixtures of the neighborhood that they agreed to do it. And then, of course, he immediately turned around, because it was all a plot, it was all subterfuge. He immediately turned around and sold his place to a guy who wanted to build a restaurant there, which became this place called the Boathouse, which isn't there anymore. And the anger that this caused among people in my neighborhood, because they felt lied to, like they were fine with it being this crappy old, barely a deli. But when it became this, restaurant where you could have a fairly civilized meal and have a drink at the bar and maybe watch a football game or something like that, they were disgusted by it. And they felt, betrayed by this other guy who had not been honest with them about the liquor license thing. And like DC is full of this stuff. Which is one of the reasons why the DC business community is suffering so badly. And the pandemic made things, much worse too. But some of that is NIMBianism, to be sure. But starting in the 1970s, we imposed at the state, local, and federal level all sorts of avenues for NIMBianism to be more powerful. And to be honest, some of them I'm in favor of, or at least I'm sympathetic to. If you go back and you look at what the old Penn Station, the one that, so there's the new Moynihan Station in New York, which is great. They converted the old post office, which was the sister building of the old Penn Station. The old Penn Station is it's just beautiful. I mean, it's just this, it's kind of out of the world of tomorrow kind of glorious, 19th century kind of architecture, giant, bay windows and pillars. And it was just this glorious thing when you look at pictures of it. And in the Robert Moses era, they tore it down and replaced it with that, massive, urinal beneath Madison Square Garden. And that launched the historic preservation movement in New York, and they saved a bunch of stuff. And I'm much more sympathetic as a conservative to saving a lot of that architectural stuff. I understand that cities need to be dynamic and change is part of city life and all that kind of stuff. but I can live with some of that. But the broader NIMBianism that you get out there, that comes from things like Buy America and also all sorts of like environmental, all these buildings have to be, there are buildings going up in New York, that now have to be completely or mostly reliant on renewable energy by 2027 or something like that. It's because of stuff like that building is more expensive. And it's also because of stuff like that buildings are uglier. And, that's one of my hopes about AI is that it kind of, Michael Brennan Doherty made this point a couple weeks ago, I guess, that, one of the great things that AI might do is might be able to sort of bring back a lot of the architecture that we've literally forgotten or have priced ourselves out of. Buildings don't have to be ugly, but given how much more expensive construction is to meet all these things, maybe we need new innovative ways of coming up with ways to design buildings, through advanced 3D printing of modules or whatever, or coming up with new materials so that, new construction can be awesome and can have all sorts of modern technology, but also look like, downtown Barcelona or Paris. I think that would be awesome. I mean, what if we could have more of those sort of classic Chicago style buildings with all of the modern stuff? This has been one of these things I've complained about a lot, about how, like, why is it we can't have cars that just look like, the old Mustangs and that kind of thing. And part of it has to do with the regulations and the requirements for efficiency and safety. And I'm for the requirements for safety and all that, but like, does everything have to be uglier? On the AI thing, so I've been thinking about this a bit. I've been working on something. I don't want to get deep into the weeds on it because I'm still doing a lot of reading on this. I've kind of gotten into this guy, René Girard, and his stuff about mimesis. Anyway, so I have this idea. If you've read something interesting, if this rings a bell with you, drop me a note. Let me put it this way. In the United States and other advanced economies, the amount of your labor dedicated to feeding yourself, keeping the lights on, and providing shelter has been shrinking over time. Obviously for poor people, it's a much bigger slice of their economic pie of their week. But, just go play with the numbers at Human Progress or look at the appendix of Suicide of the West. You'll see what I mean. I mean, the amount of time, one of my favorite measurements of this is the amount of time you have to work for an hour of light and like literally just an hour of indoor illumination. And that number has been plummeting for 2,000 years, if not more. Actually, definitely more. And it's been plunging for the last century, right? The amount of work you have to do to eat, to get the minimal number of calories to eat has been shrinking, even for unskilled labor for a very, very long time. And as you move up the economic ladder to more affluent people, that stuff is, not counting the fact people have more expensive houses and mansions and all of that kind of stuff. The sort of base necessity part of their working life has been covered, and it's a minuscule fraction of their work, right? And I think that's spreading. I mean, let's put it this way. If you take the rosy predictions about what AI can do, if you take the rosy predictions of how long it'll take for us to get fusion reactors and sort of next generation or 3 generations from now, 3D printing and all that kind of stuff, you're starting to see a world glimpsed, just over the horizon, barring some apocalyptic war or fungal virus that turns us into zombies. You're really starting to look at a world that looks a lot more like the holodeck in Star Trek than you are one that looks like, 1950s America. And, as it is, you have people who can spend very little time actually making money and a lot of time entertaining themselves, and they're perfectly happy to do it. Unfortunately, some of these people have bad ideas about entertaining themselves, and entertaining themselves is more like, video games and drug addiction, but you get the point, right? We can, the attention economy is becoming a place where people are increasingly live, or could in the future become a place where we live. And so what does a society like that look like? Again, if you take all the good stories of this, right? And let's just say it all plays out great and we have massive increases in productivity, massive increases in energy production, to the point where we start cleaning up the environment and fixing the planet, all of these things. What are the criteria by which, people get out of bed? What is it if feeding yourself and feeding your family and providing for your family and providing for yourself really can become an afterthought? Why are people getting out of bed? What are people doing? And my view is that and I don't mean to go all sort of Jordan Peterson or anything like that here, but I think the best prediction I can come up with right now, and this is the thing that I'm thinking about, is status, right? What will give one person a higher status socially, sociologically, politically than other people in that kind of economy? And that's not something I'm trying to think through. I think it's a really interesting question. I think part of what this sort of attention economy is about is that, right? I mean, right now, our definition of high status people, I shouldn't say my definition, or your definition, but the definition that a lot of people have for a high status person is some social media influencer. Like, the more followers you have, the more important you are. The more subscribers you have, the more important you are. That's one aspect of what I am talking about, is like those people, they're making money from their high status, right? Their work is their status stuff. And they're not the old complaint about capitalism was that being rich gave you high status, that making money increased your status in society. And, we forget that the original people to complain about that were not the proletariat and the working class. They were the aristocrats. The phrase, jumpstart or upstart goes back to the idea of people who were elevated above their station because of money to a certain extent, right? The old aristocrats in Europe were the descendants of warlords, right? They were the warriors who gained power, centuries earlier, and then held on to their land and were stationary bandits in the Mansur Olson sense and whatnot. And they came up with concepts like nobility and aristocracy to justify their intergenerational power and wealth. And then along come in the, starting, I guess, the 15th and 16th century, but then in earnest during the Enlightenment, these people who are able to buy titles of nobility, buy status because of their money. And the old aristocratic class hated the new bourgeois or new money type people, right? Because they thought they were all low class people with bad bloodlines and whatnot. I think that's a natural human reaction. You get that, from almost any group or organization where the newcomer is looked at suspiciously, but it's different at scale in all sorts of ways when you're talking about whole societies. It's also part of the explanation for anti-Semitism in Europe, is that, with the emancipation of Jews all of a sudden were allowed to compete in all sorts of ways in the broader, economy and broader institutions. And they did well. And that was deemed to be illegitimate in some way. But anyway, in today's society, you got particularly people under the age of, say, 30, being a celebrity is a new kind of aristocratic status. What have the Kardashians done to be, to have the place that they have in the hearts and minds of lots of people? And so anyway, like, if you, at least in the old school, like, I understand getting status, esteem, if you want a different word, social rank from being a great warrior, right? That makes sense to me. I'm not saying that we should go back to that sort of society, but it makes sense to me. And I get that, and I'm much more sympathetic to the idea of you having great status if you are a great business person and you've provided real value to society and you're rewarded in the marketplace with money. I mean, I haven't mentioned this in a long time, but I always think about Tim Carney's point about how much he hates it when he hears rich people say they want to give back to society. And his example was the guy who invented the Cronut, and which is this croissant donut hybrid, which I've never had, but it's supposed to be just friggin' delicious. And Tim was always like, look, you don't owe us anything. You gave us the Cronut, and you took like a penny on each one for your profit for you personally, other than building up your business. And we thank you for the Cronut, but you don't owe us anything more. You made the Cronut. You gave society the Cronut, and that's how I feel about all sorts of, business innovations. Is like the proof that they gave something to society is because they sold well. Obviously, if you spend 2 minutes, you can think of counterexamples that probably aren't good on this point, from everything from, drugs to pornography, but you get the point. Anyway, so what if we truly abolish poverty? What if we truly, and again, remember, we have abolished poverty in the United States as an objective matter. If you take the definition of poverty from, say, 1900 and you apply it to today, all except, essentially homeless people and a handful of subsistence living people in various backwaters are above the poverty line. And, the problem with homelessness is not a problem of poverty per se. It's a problem of lack of social capital. It's a problem of mental illness. It's a problem of drugs. But, the average working poor person in material terms, in terms of the calories that they can afford to eat, the indoor illumination, the heat, the shelter, the transportation, they live like millionaires compared to poor people 150 years ago, 125 years ago, in all sorts of ways. Their ability to travel distances, all these kinds of things. What they lack is social status, because poverty in America and in advanced industrialized nations is not an objective metric. It's a subjective metric. And, as my dad always used to say, there's nothing in economics that says we can't all be millionaires. But there is a lot in economics that says, even if we're all millionaires, some of us are going to be billionaires. There are always going to be people who are richer than other people. And this is one of the problems you get with status, right? With, social hierarchies and ranking. And in a room full of billionaires, a millionaire feels poor. And in a room full of millionaires, someone who makes $150,000 a year feels poor. Or can feel poor, right? I mean, I've actually been in rooms with lots of billionaires. I don't personally feel poor. I feel poor compared to them, which is a different thing. But that's part of the problem with a lot of the conversation of inequality in this country. It's not a conversation about poverty. It's a conversation about how they're so much richer than we are. And that's why I have less concern about it than I do about other, public policy problems. But anyway, imagine we're a society where everybody's essentially rich and you don't have to worry about the provision of food and all that kind of thing. What are the ways to think about how status plays into that? And anyway, I have lots more thoughts on this, but this is the thing I've been thinking about a bit. I'm thinking about doing this I've mentioned this before. Every year I give this big speech at this thing that AI does called World Forum, and it's always a lot of pressure on me. It's one of the only speeches I really sweat over every year because I have to think of something new to talk about, and they expect me to be funny. And also insightful and also weird, and nudity has to be tasteful. And, so anyway, I've been thinking about this. I don't know if I'm going to do it on this or not. Because it's kind of a big, broad thing. And, there's a lot of more homework I got to do. But anyway, I'm going to read this book by Neil Stephenson called The Diamond Age. While I'm on vacation next week. Pod says it's all about a society sort of based on this kind of stuff. Anyway, that's all I got. Oh, so far the feedback is overwhelmingly keep the Remnant intro as it is, or at the very least keep the music. a couple people made the very good, wonky public policy point of saying the most important variable was left out of the question, which is how much does it cost to renew the license for the music? It's a good point. I actually don't know the answer to that. Adam just told me that the license was coming up, and did I want to switch it out? And I asked you guys that question. But yes, the point is a good one from the people who made it. If the license for that music costs us $1 million, that music is going away. If that music costs us 50 cents, the music will stay. That's my decision. Now, where between 50 cents and $1 million the actual number is, I don't know. But if it's not cost prohibitive, we'll keep it at least for the foreseeable future. But thank you for the feedback. Also, thanks for the feedback about all the swag stuff. Keep that stuff coming. A lot of people insist, including Brother Starwalt, that we have to have some sort of no, you won't. This is a podcast swag of some kind. So I'm open, and I think I agree, certainly on the sticker thing. So, if people want to sort of crowdsource for me what that slogan would be, could it be like, I'll see you in the remnant. No, you won't. This is a podcast. Something like that. That'd be great. And that's all I got. Now I got to go write the LA Times column and prepare for a couple talks I'm giving out here. And I'll talk to you next time. The drone war has begun, they have. The drone war has begun, they have.